Okay. Hi, Cheyenne. How are you today?
Hi, I am doing great. How are you, Yasmin?
I'm doing well, doing well. I'm so excited. I'm so excited for this interview. Thank you so much for being willing to be a part of the Rediscovering Our American Dream project. I'm really excited to have you.
Oh, excited and honored to be here. I really appreciate you reaching out and, giving the opportunity to be a part of this. I think the project is really awesome. And I'm excited to, bring a little bit of that like native Latino perspective to the table. Like
Yes, absolutely. All of it, all of it. So Cheyenne, please introduce yourself. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Absolutely. So in true fashion, I'm going to introduce myself in Miccosukee or Ilaponge. And this is just how I've always been taught to introduce myself. And so Chihentamo, Chahochifke, Cheyenne Kotomiake, Tishet, Chahochifke, Ichotham, Seminole Katomlet, which was a very condensed version of my usual traditional introduction. But what I said in Miccosukee is that my English name is Cheyenne and my given or my traditional name is Ifet, which means fire in Miccosukee, and that I am Seminole. But I guess the other part of me, I am also Chilena. My mom was born and raised in South America, so I was also raised speaking Spanish. So hola todo. And I'm 25 years old. I live in Hollywood, Florida on the Seminole Hollywood Reservation. I was literally born and raised here my entire life. I refuse to leave. I will also die here. But I am a citizen of the Seminole tribe of Florida. And I am a former Miss Florida Seminole, as well as the last reigning, well, not last reigning, but former reigning Miss Indian World.
Yay, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheyenne, can you tell us a little more about your upbringing, what your childhood was like, what was home life like, school life, life on a reservation? I know you had mentioned earlier that you live in a city environment. So please just share more with us about how it was growing up.
Happy to, happy to. I think I am a product of my family. I'm a product of South Florida. I'm a product of my tribe and my community. I think that my upbringing was really, really unique in that, both of my parents' cultures and traditions were really present in my life. I mentioned that I, can speak Miccosukee, I can speak Spanish. And so, um, but it wasn't always that simple in my mind. When I was a kid, it was really difficult. I definitely went through that phase of being kind of uncomfortable in my skin, uncomfortable in my identity, feeling like I had to choose between the two sides of myself. And that was difficult. And that definitely played into, what it was to become a young adult and how to kind of present myself to the world. And even my schooling, I think, was all over the place too. I've been to so many different schools. I've been to a Catholic school, I've done private, I've done public. I dropped out of high school for a little bit and ended up not being welcomed back into the public school system. So I ended up at an alternative school, and that's where I graduated from in 2015. But overall, I grew up in a really big family. I'm one of six siblings, and I'm the middle child at that. So I was definitely out there. I'm definitely the black sheep of my siblings, but I've learned to embrace that. But yeah, I think, my childhood was really fun. Like I grew up as this really like rezzed out Latina girl. And, I remember like swimming in canals and like playing in mud holes, but also like celebrating Chilean Independence Day and like going all out for soccer games with the Chilean national team. And my parents just really exposed us to a lot. I traveled a lot when I was a kid. I remember going to Spain when I was like 6 years old and things like that. And so all these experiences really built me up to be this outgoing, like really unapologetic, really confident. And my parents, my mom specifically, really instilled the importance of education and that knowledge was power. And so I always knew the importance of schooling, but I really struggled with my mental health, from middle school going into high school. And I didn't know it back then, but I was going through really bad depression and really bad anxiety, which was, a big factor in me dropping out when I was about 16, 17. But overall, I remember always being really, really happy. I didn't need friends because I had my siblings and my cousins. I've always been really close with my family. We're very, very tight knit. And, coming from a community like mine on my Seminole side, growing up on the reservation, you grow up with your family all around you. And that saying, it takes a village to raise a kid, is something that's at the core of our community. It's the core of being a Native person, is that your community is part of raising you. And, an extension of your blood family is your clan family. And my family is from the Panther clan. I grew up with a million aunties, a million uncles, which I think is just very normal for people of color. Like, you meet these people when you're 13, they're like, I remember when you're a baby. I'm like, I don't know you, lady. But that's so normal for us. And, that's part of who we are as our culture. And I don't think I ever remember a point not living with my grandparents even. And to this day, I'm getting ready to move into a new house and my grandmother's coming with me. I refuse to have this lady out of the world without somebody watching her. And it was really interesting. I think my early 20s, like 18 to 21, was a really weird time for myself. And I remember I did go back to high school. I graduated, I went straight into college, like my parents encouraged me to. And they were like, pick a major, pick something that's going to be stable, something you're going to make good money in. And I'm like, well, hey, like accounting sounds cool, whatever, let's do it. So I went and I was great. I was great at accounting and I really enjoyed it because it's very structured, very routine and tedious, and it kept me busy. So I graduated, I remember, with a 4.0 and everything. And I walked for my associates. I was almost done my bachelor's and I was like, hey, I don't think I like this. I don't think I want to be a CPA or like a bookkeeper or do taxes. And so I decided not to go back to school, and not really realizing where I was at, like mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And in turn, also kind of still navigating this identity finding within myself. I went through the worst depressive episode I ever went through. And I ended up I needed serious help. And my mom found me one night just in tears on the bathroom floor. And I was really unsure of my purpose in the world. And I remember feeling like a burden to my family and a burden on my friends and not really wanting to be alive anymore. And my mom immediately took me to go get help. And that began almost like the beginning steps of a healing journey that I didn't know was in store for myself. And I began learning about mental health and learning what depression was and anxiety, and really starting to understand why very normal day-to-day things were really difficult for me, on top of having ADHD and like being mixed and like just living in the society that we live in, right? And so I began really intense therapy, and I eventually got onto antidepressants, and I started finding a new stability in my life. And I knew that I didn't want to go back to school because I did not want to be an accountant. And I thought, what is the most out of box, out of character thing that Cheyenne could do right now at 21, 22? And for years, my grandmother has encouraged myself and my sisters to run for Miss Florida Seminole. And for those that are not familiar, if you know what Miss Universe is, if you know what Miss Florida USA is, we have pageantry in Indian country, and it's very similar to that. It's an ambassadorship. You reign for a year, you compete on stage, and we have something called Miss Florida Seminole in my tribe. And my grandmother was the first crowned Miss Florida Seminole, I believe 1960, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm so sorry if that's wrong, Grandma. I'm so sorry. But I always said no. I was like, no, Bush, I'm not a pageant girl. I can't do that. And I was laughing with my sister one night about how terrible my life was, how I had no direction, and I was just not the straightest path sibling for my parents. And I thought, why not? This is like so out of box for myself. Why not? So I ran. I got my traditional clothing ready. I prepared my essay. I prepared a traditional presentation, and not really expecting it, I ended up getting crowned. And so for a year, I reigned as Miss Florida Seminole 2018, 2019. And I found myself at the center of representing my tribe in the state of Florida. And I found this confidence in myself, in my identity, in my skin, and my public speaking, my cultural knowledge, my historical knowledge, all of it really. And it helped me find me. in a really, really unanticipated but extremely beautiful way. And um, throughout my journey as Miss Florida Seminole, I was constantly reminded of the fact that we normally send our Miss Florida Seminoles to compete in Miss Indian World. Miss Indian World would be the comparing, or the it would be comparable to Miss Universe in Native pageantry. It's the highest title you can hold. Um, and for over 20 years, we've been sending our girls out there to compete, but it had never been brought back home before. And so I remember them slapping that huge application packet in front of me, and I was like, no, like I'm just gonna enjoy this title that I have right now. And I, as my confidence grew through my reign, and I realized, what do I have to lose? Like worst case scenario, I go and I lose in front of everybody. Like what's new? And so I decided to apply, and I submitted my application. In the same process, that preparation process that I had for Miss Florida Seminole. I got my dresses ready. I started preparing like my essay and all these different parts, components of the pageant, but I had a different head on my shoulders at that point. I had a different mindset. I was in a really different place emotionally and spiritually even. And so I completely immersed myself into this. And it was really weird for me because this had been the first time in my life that I wasn't in school and wasn't working a full-time job. And so I found myself with time, nothing but time to invest and dedicate into myself. And so I did it all. I practiced interviewing. I practiced my traditional presentation literally like 5,000 times in front of anybody that was willing to sit there and listen to it. I prepared every aspect of the pageant that I could. And I found myself in Albuquerque of April of 2019. And I was just ready. I was just really happy to be there. I had to go through this really, really ugly process of realizing that you are worthy of being there. Like you are Seminole, you are whole, your identity is whole, and you deserve to be up there representing your tribe, just like the rest of these other young women are. And so I just went out there with my heart on my sleeve, with like the confidence that my parents and my family instilled in me, my community gave to me. And I just gave it my all. And by Saturday night of that entire week of competing, I really didn't even care if I won or not. I was just really proud to be in that position of, you're sitting here at the center of this Coliseum with over 10,000 people watching in person, over 700,000 watching a live stream, and you did it. Like you got through this pageant. And so I ended up walking or leaving Albuquerque with best talent as well as best interview. And then I was crowned Miss Indian World, and I got to bring it home for my tribe for the first time. And I spent an entire year traveling all over the US. I also got to go to New Zealand or Aotearoa. And I served as a cultural goodwill ambassador representing all Native and Indigenous people globally for an entire year. I literally came back from my trip from New Zealand in the beginning of March. And when I came back, COVID was in full swing in the US. I was gone for 11, 12 days. I came back, we went into lockdown. Everything was closed. And I found myself in this really weird position of, wow, what's going to happen next? And because of COVID and the pandemic, the Gathering of Nations powwow was canceled, and we weren't allowed to have a pageant, of course. And so I was offered a second year, which has never happened before. And so I had a consecutive year as Miss Indian World, and I went full virtual, full social media, full Zoom live for an entire year. And I just gave it my all. I gave all of myself to that position, all of myself to Indian country, and I would do it all over again. But all of these experiences led up to me, I think, becoming Miss Indian World and being this really unapologetic, mixed young person in America.
I love that story, Cheyenne. Thank you for that. That just, I feel butterflies, and that is just a beautiful story. And I think, at least from what I've seen, some statistics, um, there's a rise in young people, from their like 17, 18 to, let's say, 23, 24, college age, who have been committing suicide. And I was just speaking to, I work with young people who have incarcerated parents in that age group, supporting them through college. And I was speaking with one of our scholars' mothers, and one of her coworkers' sons, who is also that age, attempted to commit suicide. And so there are a lot of young people now who are going through various forms of mental challenges and deep severe depression. You know, we've seen that also. And so your story would resonate with so many people, and the fact that you, in the midst of all of that, you eventually gained enough, I don't know, fire or oomph or courage to just say, to hell with it, let me just try. Like I have nothing to lose. And it probably it sounded like it started off as a joke, like, oh, okay, whatever. And
Yeah.
then it's like, the joke's on you, Cheyenne.
Yeah. A joke to say the least. And there's a rise not only in like this suicide epidemic that's happening, but also a rise in like destigmatizing those conversations. And that ended up being my platform as Miss Indian World, like really indirectly, was mental health and destigmatizing the conversations, talking about accessibility, talking about funding and resources, culturally competent care, historically competent care. All of these things, all of these factors play into all of it, on top of just the upbringing of what it is to be a Native person in the US. My experience growing up on a reservation that's right smack in the middle of the city is unique, and it's different compared to other Native people in the US that live 3 hours from the nearest grocery store, 4 hours from the nearest hospital, let alone, a behavioral health clinic or a mental health facility. And, not for nothing, I definitely think that the experience that I had through my own mental health journey was really ugly. It was really hard. And that's the reality of that, is that it's uncomfortable. It's really hard to be vulnerable. It's really hard to look past the internalized stigmas that we create about mental health because of the communities that we come from. And that is very prevalent in communities of color, is you don't talk about that. That's a taboo topic. You have a roof over your head, you have clothes on your back, and you have food on the table. What are you upset about? You have nothing to be upset about. And that was exactly what was like in my household. It was very normal, and then bringing in the discussion of historical traumas, intergenerational traumas. These things are so real. And I saw that within my family. And I think that we're seeing this movement, this push of young people saying, we're going to stop these cycles. I'm going to be the cycle breaker, and I'm going to help my family. And in a way, without even realizing that was going on, that happened within my family. And now it is an open discussion with my family. And, it was an uncomfortable talk I had to have with my parents, and it was sad to even see that, for them to think like, did we not do a good job with you guys? Like, we gave you everything we could. And it was like, you could have bought me everything I wanted in the world. It wouldn't have changed that. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about how big our house was or how nice our clothes was. It was just, this unfortunately is what's present. You know what I mean? And so it was worth it. All of it was worth it. Like, it was really hard. And there were so many points that I didn't think that I was going to get through with it, or through it, I mean, but I found a purpose through that. And so now, I go into schools, I go to conferences, I speak with kids. I work now for a nonprofit called the Center for Native American Youth that was founded on suicide prevention in Indian country for Native youth. And I go into these schools and I'm like, yo, I was a dropout. Like, I was on antidepressants, but I was still in this Indian world. And there's power in that. There's power in owning your story, like owning the things that make you who you are. And, more than anything, if there was ever a message that I wanted to put out into the world, was like, own yourself, be unapologetic. Like, you are not broken. You're not whole because of anything that anybody tries to tell you, but you're here for a reason. One of our teachings is that the Creator has given all of us a purpose in our life. And in a way, by being a dropout and realizing that I didn't want to be in college and be an accountant, I found that for myself. I found the purpose that I'm supposed to be serving right now as a 25-year-old. And I do it, with so much love for my community behind it. And, there's a saying that I've heard where it's like, be the wind behind, that person's back, not the spit in their face. And that's what I just try to be like that wind. I'd be like, go. Like, and so, yeah, I laugh. I think that's literally me in a nutshell. And I'm kind of taking on this new chapter of myself. I just gave up my title not that long ago. And I started my position with CNAY in July, if I'm not mistaken, as a communications consultant. And I've been able to channel this like social media thing that I have, and mental health and public speaking. And I feel like I'm still able to give back to the world. And that's what I love.
That's so beautiful, Cheyenne. You must have memorized all of the questions. You literally answered nearly all of the questions, which is wonderful. So the only other question, you literally answered all the questions. The only other question, um, well, I think, yeah. What is your, do you feel like, so there's a question about how has a pandemic impacted you and your family? Is there anything other than what you've already shared, other ways that the pandemic impacted you, or your family?
I think, the impact has been really similar to what it's been for a lot of people and their families, like having to distance from one another, the difficulties of, like living literally in separate households, school wise, work wise, socially, emotionally. But, kind of taking that perspective and like zooming it out, my community was hit really hard by COVID. And my community is not very big. My tribe consists of about 4,700 tribal members, which any loss is a great loss for our people. That's somebody that held history, that held stories, language. They were not only part of their blood family, but their clan family, as well as our community. And our community is not big. So everybody knows everybody. Even if you don't know them, they know you. And so COVID was really hard because we're so communal in everything that we do. We celebrate everything as a community. I mean, and even now, our tribe is still on a lockdown. We're still on lockdown, even though the rest of the world is like going on and Florida is like loose and wild. My community is still on lockdown. We do not have any community events. We are only in level 1, which means that like our community centers have opened, but everything's still on an appointment basis. But the losses that we have had experienced has been like, it's not really describable in words. It hurts. Like there was a good point where about 3 months ongoing, we had a funeral almost every single week. And if you talk to like anybody else that's non-native, that's like very scary to hear, and it's like intense to hear. But you could probably speak to any tribal member from any community, any reservation, any tribal nation, and they'll tell you that their experience was very similar through COVID. And it was hard. It was really, really hard because you're already going through this really weird, intense era of your life of living through a pandemic, right? So there's just the hard aspects of that in itself. But then you bring on the fact that we haven't been together as a community in over 2 years. You bring together the fact that you're going through this constant mourning. It's not a phase, it's not a couple weeks. It's like we're having so many funerals, so many passings that you almost become desensitized to it. And I've seen the effects that it's had on my community. I mean, there's like this really large emotional disconnect that our people I don't think have ever experienced before. And we're having to like readjust and pivot how we communicate and interact as a community. But even my own family, we've had to figure out how to do things. I remember doing, like a drive-by for my grandma's birthday. And I just remember crying so hard because we couldn't just be together. And I know that everybody experienced that, but I have to point out the disparities that Native communities experience because of this. And my community, my tribe is very, very blessed in that we had access to PPE gear, we had access to all the things that really helped us get through this. But there was communities that didn't have that access. There's reservations that don't have running water. There's reservations that don't have plumbing and electricity. And how are you supposed to address like this modern pandemic without like modern accessibility? And so, as Miss Indian World, I spoke out about that very, very openly about the fact that my people all over the United States didn't have that accessibility, don't have those resources available to them. And so that I think is what makes the difference in experience for Natives versus, just the average population of the United States.
Thank you for sharing that, Cheyenne. I also spoke with a woman, a native woman named Sunrose, Sunrose Ironshell. She's from, I think, South Dakota, but she now lives in Iowa, and she lives on a reservation. And she was describing some similar challenges, including technology. And she's an art teacher, and she was explaining how the system, it was a Eurocentric system, and it didn't help at all. And having people, if some made families of several family members in one small apartment or one small
Hmm.
house, and so everybody's trying to use the internet and it's just not working, like all of these things. So thank you so much for your transparency and highlighting some of the disadvantages and disparities that natives have and still are facing throughout the pandemic. And so my last and final question for you, and I'm just going to let you rip on this one, is when you hear the phrase the American dream, um, what what comes to mind? What do you think about? How do you interpret that?
When I hear the American dream, I hear like this. I feel like there's still so much erasure that happens because, like, what is the American dream? What even motivated that? Like, where was that created? And the reality is that there has to be a recognition of that stemming from like manifest destiny and colonization and like building a better new world. But the reality of that is that what was here, what was existing, was beautiful, was intelligent, was working, and we weren't these primitive savage people that we get painted out to be in Eurocentric focused history books. And so when I hear American dream, I'm like, my dreams are so beyond that, so beyond the lens of colonialism and Eurocentric idealism and Western societal standards. They're so beyond that. And, when I think of my dream and what I want for my life, and, really touching back on my teachings of what I was taught as a little girl and what I've carried into my adulthood as a young person, it's thinking about future generations. I think about my children, and their children, and what type of world I want for them. And I want my children to experience what I was able to experience, which was, like swimming in canals and like playing in mud holes and watching my uncles like gator wrestle, or my aunt sew in front of me, or my sisters showing me how to sew and learning how to basket weave and learning how to make turtle soup. Like, I want there to be this push of just representation for Native people, acceptance. I want my people to be heard. And not only heard, but I want, for us and the autonomy over like the land even to be acknowledged and accepted. And that's where, when I think of, what is my dream, like what is Cheyenne's dream, I think it's like an unapologetic Indigenous future. Because even just looking at the state of the world now, Native people are at the front line of so many fights to save every aspect that's needed, which is, fighting climate justice or climate change, fighting for equity, fighting for rights, fighting for recognition, fighting just to be seen as modern people. And my dream is that all of those things are accomplished and that my great, great, great grandbabies get to live a beautiful, unapologetic life.
Well said, Cheyenne. Well said. And do you have you touched on this earlier? What advice would you give someone? I would think maybe more specifically, what advice would you give young Native people?
I would tell these young Native people that you're beautiful, you're strong, you are so powerful, and you're so capable of everything that you envision in your mind, and that the creator's plan for you is detailed and it's tough, but there's a beautiful outcome to that journey. And it's those hard points, they're going to be there. Recognize they're going to be there, but it's going to be okay because you have people that are not only praying for you right now and your success and your livelihood, but you were prayed into existence thousands of years ago, long before colonization, long before the United States existed, long before this interview happened. There was people that prayed for you to be here, and you're here. And the only obligation or responsibility that you have is to live a beautiful and whole life.
Amen. Thank you, Cheyenne.
Thank you, Mado and Shanabashar, for this opportunity.
Absolutely.